It's the Leading on Purpose podcast, helping leaders, teams, and organizations lead more intentionally, effectively, and with purpose. Well, thanks for tuning in yet again to the Leading on Purpose podcast. Like you, Doug and I are continuing to think about change. And so today we're going to pick things up right where we left off and continue our conversation around the concept and impact of change. So, Doug, you ready to talk some more about change? What's going on all around us?
Absolutely. It is inevitable in this world. So yeah, great topic.
Yes. So I think one of the first things we agreed we need to do is maybe describe the difference between change management and change leadership. And you could call it just, linguistics terminology thing, but I think it's pretty important. Change management, and one of the things you'll hear us talk about as we get into the emotions related to change, married with the process of change, is you need to pay attention to really both sides of the coin here as we talk about change. And so you're going to hear us talk about change management versus change leadership. When we talk about change management, we're talking about that very necessary side of things, which includes, communication plans, the project plan, the process side of change. But more importantly, I think what we want to propose is that there's an underserved side of change, which is the change leadership side. And this is the side as we talk about change hitting and the impact it has. It's the very human side of this experience as change sets in. And so in our last episode, we talked a lot around how we gear up to choose the right priorities that then become a change initiative. And a lot of those are process-related conversations to set the table for change. But one of the things we have to pay very close attention to, again, because it's underserved, is the human experience as change sets in. Now, the problem is we talk around a lot of these human components of change is, one, they're very predictable. They're going to happen as we describe these things. You can't short circuit the human impact that change has. But unchecked, if we don't pay attention to the impact change has on people, it can be very lethal to your organization. And so it's very natural that this stuff is going to happen, but extremely important that we anticipate it, pay attention to it, and kind of lean courageously into the human side of this change process. Doug, as I kind of set the table for the difference between change management, change leadership, what comes to mind for you? Those two terms and these two different sets of ideas.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and John, you and I have talked about this a little bit, so I'll be vulnerable here and disclosing. When I think back on my leadership career, one of the things that comes to mind is how unaware and unknowledgeable I was about both sides of this coin that you're talking about from a process standpoint and change management and how to really make sure that your I's dotted, T's crossed, clear communication plans. That kind of came to me in my leadership career, but the human element, the leadership side of this, looking back on it, just I wouldn't say I was totally oblivious to it. I had some awareness that the human element plays a role in change, but I think the most embarrassing thing to me is I always approach change more from a rational mind standpoint, meaning, well, this change makes sense. Here's the ROI. Why wouldn't we do this? Why wouldn't anybody not accept this? And if people just see the idea and the merit of the idea, why wouldn't they accept it? And so I'm looking forward to our conversation today, just to more deeply explore not only that change management side, but the change leadership side as well. And to me, one of the authors I've always been a big fan of for many, many years, and John, I know you're familiar with his work as well, as John Kotter from Harvard. And he is, for the most part, credited calling out several decades ago that critical difference between management and leadership. So for our listeners, if this idea resonates around change, several of Kotter's books, if you took a look at, or he's published in a lot of the Harvard Business Reviews, take a look at that. So it's that's really where we're going today, is really compare and contrast. And I love the way you tee this up. They're both important. You have to have both of them in order for change to be successful.
Yeah. And one of the things you'll hear Doug and I do today is ensure that we credit the sources here. And so when I think about John Kotter, the book that jumps to the top of the list is actually called A Force for Change. And so if
Right.
our listeners out there are interested in learning more, what are we talking about, in terms of what John Kotter worked on, studied, and coined in terms of the differences between management and leadership, I think A Force for Change rises to the top of the list. And
Absolutely.
just on a personal note, I think it was probably a year and a half ago, I was preparing for a session I was facilitating. And, sometimes you just look over at your bookshelf and a book you haven't talked about,
Hmm.
thought about, picked up in a long time just jumps off the shelf. There's that book, A Force for Change. And I think it was published maybe in the 90s,
Yes. Yes, it was.
and pulled that off the shelf and you start flipping through it. It's amazing how much of it rings just as true today as it did when he first authored it. And so definitely something I would take a look at. Doug, you mentioned the idea of rationalization in the face of change. And one of the things that's really tempting to do as a leader is, when a change is proposed and brought to the table, is to really try to get your head wrapped around it rationally and say, this makes sense. The math is there. There's a lot of credibility to this idea, and we could almost try to sell ourselves on it, and in turn lead ourselves to believe that, well, it's such a good idea, the math is there, the due diligence was done on this idea, some smart people thought this up, everyone else ought to feel the same way too.
Yep.
And if anyone does not feel that way or pushes back, and we'll talk about resistance and its role in this whole change process, particularly the human side of it, that if I encounter some of this pushback, it's evidence that people are not falling in line.
Yep.
And be really careful for yourself as a leader, because I think sometimes you can feel that your job is to kind of buy in somewhat blindly to what the organization is signing up for. And I'm not saying don't do that. There is some merit to you as a leader saying to yourself, okay, the organization has decided this is the direction. When I cash my check every month, I'm kind of signing on for what the organization is saying that they're going to do. And, it's not their plan. This is our plan now. But be careful with that, because taken to too far an extreme, as you consider your team's experience with this new idea that's going to be rolled out, it can be very tempting as you're rationalizing it in your own brain to assume that everyone else ought to be able to get their head wrapped around it and kind of fall in line blindly.
Yes.
And so it's a big watch out for in this whole change process. And so earlier when I said, these human components that we're going to discuss, you need to expect them. You need to anticipate them. Furthermore, you probably need to get out ahead of these things and make them okay. Make it okay for people to go through this very human experience.
Yeah. Not only is it okay, it can be very productive. And so as a leader, to one, be aware that's very predictable. People are going to have this emotional response. And then as a leader, show up in a way that allows you to have deeper understanding of not just what the responses are, but what's kind of the why behind it. Why are you reacting this way? And as we get into the model today in our conversation, we'll get into that more deeply. But John, it's I mentioned before my knowledge around successfully managing and leading change in organization was not as great as it should have been during my leadership career. One of the embarrassing things I remember, especially more in my senior leadership career, that when there's this initial idea, something's going to change in the organization, it's being discussed at the table with your colleagues, and one in particular I'm thinking about is a major change for the organization. The details aren't important. And when I think back on it, when I first heard about the idea, when our CEO brought it forward, I had this kind of visceral reaction to it around, I'm not so certain this makes sense, or I could come up with all kinds of reasons not to do it.
Yeah.
And then we spent months, we had consultants involved. We were looking at data and information. This was one of those projects that was so important in the competitive landscape industry. We had legal documents that we had to sign as we got exposure to the information. And so we went through this process, and as time went on, I started to see the merits of it and understand it better. And it started to make sense to me. And then if you fast forward, we went forward with this change, and the reaction to it was not the best, to put it mildly. And when I think back on it, the reaction we were getting from people throughout the organization was very similar to the reaction that I initially had regarding that. But because I'd had the luxury of sitting in meeting upon meeting and exposure to information and having conversations, I had actually kind of worked through the cycle that you and I are going to talk about, and came to a place of acceptance as I explored the idea. But what's interesting to me, it just never occurred to me that people throughout the organization are going to go through that. So, as leaders, I think we just have to always keep in mind our own reaction to it. What information were we privy to? What opportunity were we given to work through it? And then when that announcement comes out, just to assume people are going to fall in line because the leadership team says this is what's best for us is just naive. And so anyway, I just want to share my own personal experience with it, and just I was just blind to it. And if I had been better aware of the concepts that we're going to discuss today, I think I would have shown up much more effectively for my team and other associates throughout the organization that were really struggling with why we were doing what we were doing.
Yeah. I'm pick on you a little bit because I think it happens to a lot of leaders. I know it happened to me several times in trying to be an effective change leader. Is once you have processed and wrapped your head around the change, and as you said, you start to see the light, see the merits behind it, and then it comes time to turn around and start to deploy it to the organization. How quickly we as leaders forget the process that we went through to get to where we're at.
Exactly.
And so now you're interacting with members of your team that maybe this is their first blush. They haven't touched this at all. And you forget that distinct advantage that you've had. And so one of the big factors that you'll want to think about as you think about leading change with your teams is the importance of time. Time is an important factor when it comes to this. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today and probably in follow-up conversations together as we think about helping people through this change process, helping them through their own emotions, helping them find the merit, behind changes that we're rolling out. Time. The more time we can give people, the better. And just a quick example of this, I was in a lot of situations over the years in my corporate days of going out and soliciting feedback from people on, we'd maybe do some beta testing, as they call it, on a change idea, roll it out to, just a small geographic market, see if the idea has any traction. And I noticed the efficacy of feedback, the quality of the feedback that we would get from people would look different depending on how much time we gave them and how soon we pulled them under the tent. And so just maybe right out of the gate, one of the things to think about as a leader to have a more positive impact on people's change experience is the sooner you can pull people in, the better. And what I saw in a lot of those feedback exercises that we engaged with is the later that I asked someone how they felt about a particular change initiative, meaning the closer it was to actual D-Day, launch day, the more their feedback sounded like, let me tell you all the reasons why this won't work. The earlier you get people involved, the earlier you ask for feedback, the more time there is to maybe make some changes based on that feedback. I've found the more that feedback sounds like, well, let me tell you how we could make this work better. And so if you were to plot that on a continuum alongside time, I think you would see the earlier I get you involved, the more your feedback may be more constructive and help us maybe change the way that we're rolling this out or something about the initiative itself. The later I get you involved, I tell you the day before at the town hall, hey, this is all changing, the more it's going to be serious resistance. You throwing up a bunch of red flags on why this won't work. And so you want to have time be on your side. Now, why doesn't that happen as often? As we've said multiple times in our podcast episodes, leaders generally wake up in the morning with good intent. And so that good intent sends us sideways sometimes in terms of change leadership. And so I know for me, my temptation oftentimes was, well, I'm not going to tell my team anything about this change until I get all the information, all the facts gathered. Because I don't want to seem, non-credible. I don't want to give them information that has holes in it. I don't want to give them information or truths that may shift tomorrow. And so there's this temptation sometimes as a leader to perfect your change communication. I'm going to wait till everything's gathered. Literally in my mind, I'm like, I'm going to set a meeting on the calendar, create all these beautiful slides. We're going to get together and I'm going to download all the information. Well, the problem was by the time we actually got to that magical date on the calendar, one of two things happened. One, the facts I had pulled together had changed. Because one of the things you'll find is truth. The truth is a moving target. The headlines are always changing when change is setting in. Or worse, before that magical meeting where I did the big download of all the information, the team would find out from someone else what was actually going on. And so now their perception of me is that I sit on information. And so you've got to get comfortable as a leader with a lot of vulnerability when it comes to change communication. Messy, frequent, informal is the way when it comes to change communication. Let go of your perfect slides and this perfectly drafted memo, and everyone's going to find out at the same time. I think you got to get more comfortable because of the time factor that's required to be successful with all this, pulling people in earlier, which means the information might be messier. And that's going to have to be okay. Because I think you build more trust that way when you pull people in early. To your point, Doug, you learn information you need to learn about the initiative itself in terms of the feedback you need to make this successful. You just gain so much. But I also get it because I've been there. When you get up in the morning and you go, I don't want to give my team, half the information, missing pieces of information. I want to have all of it gathered together. You're actually doing them a disservice in the process.
Yeah, one of the I love your description of let's have it perfect before you bring them in. And if there's anyone in this world that has the desire to get things perfect and buttoned up, that would be myself. And I remember one of the hesitations I had with informing people around even change that's being considered is, to me, the downside is, well, what if we don't do it? And particularly if it's a change that maybe people are going to be excited about. And I think I learned over the years that, getting people's expectations raised that something's going to happen and then it doesn't happen. There's, it's like promising to do something with your kids, a special trip or something, and then for some reason it can't happen. But I think that's going to happen inside organizations. And then as a leader, you just need to follow up and be comfortable and sharing with them, here's why it's not happening, or it's going to happen a little bit differently or later. But I think what you gain, if you're willing to take that risk, is just richer information and much more effective if you do move forward with something, how you go about it. So I do remember times when it's like, I don't want to get my team's hopes up because this may not happen. And therefore, I'm going to keep it very close to the vest and just approach it from my limited knowledge and not involve them. And I suppose there could be some extenuating circumstances where you need to do that. But I think most generally, you have to be willing to do exactly what you said. Have it be a bit messy, informal, start to populate the idea. And just, I think that just helps the readiness of your team.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you the impact on the receiving end. The best leader I ever worked for was fantastic at bringing me under the tent early, as they say.
Yep.
And one of the things she was very effective at that I think helps with some of the concerns that you just raised is she was very intentional and very effective at letting me and the rest of the team know what she wanted us to do with this information she was sharing.
Hmm.
And now, if you go back in time and if the CEO in the organization were to find out some of the things she was sharing, maybe they wouldn't have been too terribly pleased. But because she teed it up in such an effective way, the outcome was the highest levels of trust you can imagine.
Right.
That she's trusting me with this information. But in terms of teeing it up, what she was so good at is she would, come to us and say, "This is a keep under your hat type thing. You cannot share this with anyone else. But I want to let you know, here's some wheels that are starting to turn." Versus, "Hey, here's something that's gonna happen. It's a ways off. I'd like you to start thinking about it now. Don't spend too much time on it. We'll regroup in about 2 months and get serious around our plan, but just wanted to plant that seed." And so just really good around, with examples like that, just priming the pump in the right way. Because to your point, you also don't want to, get people's alarm bells going for the wrong reasons. Because there's a serious risk here if you don't manage all this, human side of change properly. You can introduce a lot of distractions. And change will very naturally bring distraction, anyways. And as new things are coming down the pike, people sometimes just stop doing their job because they're so distracted by the noise around these new and innovative, potentially creative ideas. And so you don't want to cause that. You don't want to send off alarm bells. And so I think teeing it up in the right way is one of the most effective things you can do if you're, going to take this on and say to yourself, you know what, I do need to bring people under the tent early. I want my team to know pretty much as soon as I know what's going to happen, what's likely to happen, because it builds such a level of trust. There's so much to gain with it. And
Yep.
on the flip side, I think there's a lot to lose. If your team starts to develop the perception of you as a leader that you sit on information, you hold stuff back, think about the message that sends. I don't trust you enough to share this with you. And everyone else is going to find out before you. It just,
Right.
yeah. And so there's a lot to be gained and also a lot to be lost. The stakes are raised when it comes to change communication. So a lot of what we're going to point to, as you can probably already tell, is related to communication. That's what you got in your back pocket in terms of effectively leading members of your team through change. One of the other things I want to make sure that I don't gloss over, because sometimes it can seem obvious to me, it may not be obvious to you out there as you think about leading teams through changes. Your team's experience of change, you might ask yourself, whose responsibility is that? And I think one of the myths, one of the mistakes that's made, it's like, well, that's the organization's communication department. Or if we have a group in the organizations that's in charge of, managing all the changes going on, or the project management team, the PMO office, sometimes we can point the finger at those groups or even the executive team and say, well, they own the success of this change. I want you to shift your thinking on that. You own the experience that your team has and how effectively they're able to wrap their head around change and what level of buy-in we're able to generate. That's on you. And I'll just real quickly point back to some leadership theory that Doug and I have talked about, which is, 70 to 80% of how your team feels working in their job is a result of you, your behaviors, your level of communication. Translate that to change. 70 to 80% of their experience of change, their buy-in around change, has nothing to do with the merit of the idea, nothing to do with the communications team. It's you as the leader. And so there's a high level of ownership that has to be taken on here.
Yeah, I love that sense of personal accountability as a leader for your team's experience with change. And typically, and again, when I'm thinking about change right now, I do tend to think about big organizational change. But anything that we're talking about today, John, applies to frontline leaders, even, just like
Absolutely.
in our last episode, as we talked about change on that scale. But it's it's kind of that, sometimes it's the meeting after the meeting
It is.
that's so important. And I can remember sitting in, all associate meetings and organizations where a big announcement was made and a change was rolled out, or, whatever it is. And probably sometimes I did it well and sometimes not so well. But as a leader, as you keep in mind that when people are initially hearing that, there's a lot going on for them, both kind of the rational mind evaluating the idea, but just even the emotional impact. And so just to even take the time to have that meeting after the meeting,
Yep.
whether it be in small groups or even individually, and just ask people, how are you doing with this? What's been going on for you? Either what excites you about what you're hearing, what is not exciting to you, what concerns you. Just talk to me. And I'll tell you what, if you can just make yourself invest that time with your team, there's so much that you can learn. And again, the relationship building that goes on in those moments with a leader, just so important.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned, the meeting after the meeting. I think the other thing to avoid is assuming one meeting after the meeting is enough.
Right.
You don't know, to your point, Doug, what that person's currently tasked with, what they're thinking about, what's on their plate. And so maybe it didn't hit them the right way the first meeting after the meeting. And so, really, in your ownership as a leader of your team's experience and the communication you're providing related to the change, it's constant communication to the point it may sound or feel exhausting. So, the job of really reinforcing clarity and providing communication to your team as it relates to change is never done. It's not a check the box type activity.
Yep.
And I think a kind of a cardinal sin all leaders should watch out for is sitting in a room with some of your colleagues and saying to yourselves, well, we told them.
Right.
That's not even in the vicinity of enough. And so it's appreciating this is a constant communication process that we have to engage with. And our job of providing, clarity and new truths as they emerge related to the change is never done. And that can be daunting because there's this reliance on corporate level communication and memos to give our teams the clarity they need. The magic happens in that meeting after the meeting, after you help them digest information, and then later you reinforce that. I think it's critical.
We talked, maybe this is in our conversation today, we'll mention several different names and thought leaders. We talked about John Cotter and then the late Dr. Stephen Covey. One of the ideas that he had that I always found really very useful when it comes to change. He would talk about change inside organizations, and as a leader leading a team of people is to be aware of who on your team really has the influence with the other team members. And he would even point out, too, that influence has nothing to do with a person's job title. It's just who are those individuals and throughout the organization that are well respected, have a lot of credibility. And many times those folks will either help you be successful with change inside an organization or absolutely, stand in your way. And so I'm not suggesting that a leader would ever not talk to everybody on their team, but if your time is limited, then by golly, probably the highest and best investment of time, at least in my opinion, would be the members of my team who are the influencers that have that high credibility. Check in with them, because I will guarantee you those individuals are having conversations with other team members, other people in the organization. These are the water cooler conversations around, where they, hey, so what are you thinking about this idea? And that's where it really happens inside organizations. As much as we want to thank the wonderful PowerPoint that we put together and the corporate memo that went out and was edited, 50 times by 50 different people, it's important. I don't mean to minimize it, but the reality is it's those real conversations. So anyway, as you're listening to this, as you're thinking about change within the world that you're responsible for, is who are your influencers? Who are those folks that you really need to have your finger on their pulse to understand where are they on this? Because if they're not excited about it, that could have an impact. If they are excited about it, how do you leverage that to help spread that? So anyway, that was an idea that I always found very useful from Dr. Covey around understanding how important influence is throughout the organization and have clarity on who truly are the champions of influence and change within your team.
Yeah. Yeah. A way to think about it is that meeting after the meeting is happening whether you facilitate it or not as the leader. And so who are they rallying around? That strongest, most influential voice on the team who likely doesn't have a title, but through relationships and credibility and lots of things, the team counts on their perspective. And so getting that person on board, being very mindful of their experience of the change, absolutely critical. And maybe from a process or project side of this, could get some of our listeners thinking about, as I'm putting together the team to help deploy this change, I think oftentimes we lean too heavily into the subject matter experts. So we're going to roll a change initiative. Well, whatever kind of topic or department that falls under, let's find the smartest, most technically proficient people related to that topic or department to lead the change. Well, if they don't have influence, they don't have credibility and rapport with people, you're actually not going to get a lot of traction out of those people's support. Right. Now, you need those people on the project. You need people's subject matter expertise and help us understand how this gets grooved into our current, systems and processes as an organization. But maybe part of that project team needs to be very intentionally looking at who has influence out there, who has a voice with all the employees. Those are individuals that we need to bring into the fold sooner than later. And, I think the other thing to think about with those influencers, it's easy to assume, well, an influencer ought to be someone who falls in line right away blindly. No, oftentimes these influencers are our strongest sources of resistance. But boy, what a win if you can get under the hood and really understand where is that resistance coming from? What about this change kind of triggers some of those emotions? If I can understand that with an influencer, boy, now when it comes time to, deploy this to the masses, this change, our chances of creating buy-in go way, way up if I can understand and appreciate that.
I'm smiling to myself. This goes years ago. I had an individual on my team who, looking back on it now, back when I was experiencing the relationship with this person on this team, I would have said they were kind of a pain in the ass at times. But here's what they were really good at doing is if there was a new idea, some kind of change that we're implementing, their natural hard wiring from a personality standpoint was to be that devil's advocate, was to pick it apart. And they were so good at thinking about concerns or issues or things that would help us not be successful that I hadn't thought about. But it can be irritating to be in a relationship with a person like that. It's like, oh man, you're just like this downer. It's like, can you never? But there's real value to having that perspective. Now, the thing about this person is, I learned that if they had their voice heard and an opportunity to give their input, they get on board. But what didn't work well with that person is if they weren't part of the conversation, if they weren't giving their input, and then we put the idea in place, anything that would go wrong with it, they get to sit on the sidelines and go, well, told you so, or that's not a good idea. So as much as these individuals at times can almost feel like they're slowing us down, it can be a bit of an energy drain. There's, why can't you be more of a team player? Taken to the extremes, that can be an issue for sure. Yeah. But there's so much value that can come from those individuals who are courageous enough to speak their truth and pick apart an idea. And even though it's hard to hear, just never underestimate the value that those folks can bring to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. The other factor that this all makes me think about too is, we talked about the temptations that rationalizing change can bring to you as an individual leader. Meaning, as you wrap your head around the merits of it, it can tempt you to feel like, well, other people ought to be able to see the math as well and
Yep.
get on board with this blindly sometimes, which is just not the case. The other factor at play here that you have to pay attention to is the further you go down, and I hate using the word up and down when we talk about organizational structure, but it's the best way to make my point. As we move on down through the organization and we get closer to the front lines, when you think about most change initiatives, the degree of impact it has on people is higher the closer you get to the front lines of the organization.
Mm.
And so the more people you ask, the more open you are to resistance, pushback, feedback, that type of stuff, the more you're appreciating that, boy, at the top levels of this organization, there's no way we could anticipate what this would feel like the closer we get to the people, who are actually doing the work that has to change.
Yep. Yep.
And so an example that comes to mind is about 15 years ago. I was in the restaurant industry, as you know, and there was a decision being made to replace a pretty expensive piece of kitchen equipment and basically adjust our cooking platform. And so at the top levels of the organization, there was some change to go through to wrap their heads around because of the cost. It's like, we're going to roll out this new cooking platform. It's going to cost X amount of dollars times X amount of locations. We're talking millions. But as you think about the experience of the impact of that change, once they got over the price tag at that level, at the top level of the organization, they were already on to, greener pastures. Look at the marketing we could do and the new menu items we could bring on board and the excitement. Well, so this new cooking platform idea then, leaves the executive table and comes into the director and VP conversations, which is where I sat at the time. And at the time, I was in charge of the training for the organization. And they said, well, we're going to change the cooking platform. And so I'm sitting there going, well, great. We just rolled out new training. Now we get to do that all over again because this new cooking platform fundamentally changes the way we train new employees in the kitchen area. So the impact on me already, only once removed from the executive table, much greater. Okay. Yep. Well, now we start moving through the organization, getting closer to the location level. And so we had a level kind of like an area manager overseeing 8 to 10 locations. And so you start to announce to that group, hey, we're going to change the cooking platform. Well, they had all sorts of different questions. Are we going to close for a day while we switch out the equipment? Do we get extra dollars for retraining people? What's the labor impact? Is the janitorial crew or the kitchen crew in charge of cleaning? Like all sorts of very tactical day-to-day operation related questions that probably weren't anticipated at that first table. Okay. Well, you get all the way down through the organization. How did this impact the line cooks that were actually using the cooking equipment? Huge. We're going to change the way you spend 40 hours a week of your life. And so to even imagine that in that executive table or even, our director VP level table, that you could anticipate the impact that would have on people at the front lines of the organization, next to impossible without asking. And so as we continue to compare the worlds of change management versus change leadership, you need both. You need a process, you need a project plan, you need that side of change. But the temptation that can bring is, boy, if we do that well enough, we can out-engineer people's experience of the change. We can short circuit any pushback, resistance, dips in productivity. And we're here, Doug and I are here to tell you, no, you can't. Yep. You can't even anticipate how this might impact people as you get closer to the front lines. And so again, I'll say it, you need that process side. You need a plan. You need all that. But don't assume that it takes the place of this very human side of the impact of change.
Well, John, this may take us on a little bit of a tangent, so I won't belabor this point. As you talk about this type of change that's being considered, very common in organizations to try out a change on a small scale just to see what the risk. So, like a cooking platform, my guess is in your situation, there was a bit of testing in a few units on this cooking to get some data and see. And one of the mistakes that I noticed when I was also in the restaurant industry, but other organizations as well, is when you're quote unquote testing an idea that could have change throughout the organization, is sometimes one case I'm thinking about, there were so many resources devoted to testing the change at the local level. So, like, say, a new cooking platform. Well, they're in the kitchen. You've got chefs and other R&D folks, and maybe the manufacturer of that cooking plant, and they're all there, and they're, it's just, it's not a realistic environment. They get this super, super hyper training
Right.
experience, and so you test out the change in an environment that's nowhere close to the reality that
Right.
most people are going to experience the change. And let's say it goes well, and so you can come to some conclusions that maybe are just going to kick your hindside, because it's like, well, we tested it in 5 of our restaurants and this idea worked just great. And here's our customer satisfaction scores. And our folks, why is this thing blowing up on our face as we go out to 2,000 units all at once? So there's even that element of, again, this is getting more deeply into the, both the change management and change leadership element of it, is just be very aware of how you're even testing the waters with your ideas, because you can have some false reads on how things are going to work if it's not done in a quote unquote real world kind of way.
Yeah. Just maybe continuing the tangent for just a moment. I can remember being on the other end of this
Hmm.
and being more on the operation side in the restaurant industry and having them say, okay, we're rolling out this new thing. Oh, we tested it. And so a lot of us would ask the question, well, where did you test it? And they give you the list of locations, and it's
Oh,
like, well, those are top performing President's
right.
Club, high accolade, perfect environments, no turnover. Just
Yep.
you talk about testing in a bubble. It's
Yep.
like, no, you could roll out anything in some of those locations, and it would likely
Right.
it would likely work. And so part of the discipline, I think, behind the testing of change, and even as change rolls, gathering feedback, is to go looking for bad news. And so it's in the questions you ask, it's in who you ask, it's in how you test. It's another messy aspect of change. We said communication needs to be messy. This feedback process, we need to be willing to
Yep.
step into some soup and get burned and ask some questions that we maybe didn't want to ask or are uncomfortable hearing the answer to. Those can glean some of the most important insights. And you don't need to be afraid of, oh, this is going to cause us to have to throw out the change. No, it may teach you some things around how to roll it out differently to make it more successful.
Yep.
Or one thing that's often overlooked, it may teach you what are some things we need to alleviate or remove from the priority list for these individuals to make this change work. It's in place of sometimes that can make a change successful. But yeah, really, really good tangent there, because I think it's an important component of just how we lean into the messiness and vulnerability that makes change successful.
Well, and John, so our example, there was a big company rollout change, but again, coming back to those frontline supervisors that are implementing change, even thinking about your associate population on kind of that bell curve as well, is this idea that you want to implement whatever it is, whatever the change is. The equivalent of what we just described would be, your top performers and how do they do with the idea. And again, you've got some people on your staff, they're just so talented, so dedicated, so experienced. They're going to figure out ways to make it work. But it's that middle population, and I don't mean that in a
No,
derogatory way.
there's no other way to describe it, unfortunately.
Yeah, so it's your average, but average is just rock solid, come into work, get things done. To really understand, those are the folks who are really going to dictate how well this goes in terms of your implementation of the change. So anyway, if you're listening to this going, I'm not involved in change initiatives across the big, say restaurant company or whatever it is, but it applies to even more localized change within a department as well. And any testing that you do in population of the socialization of the idea is a broad spectrum to get a better sense of how it's going to work.
Yeah, and so you mentioned localized change. There's assumptions and dangers at that level, because at
Sure.
that level, it's really easy to say as a leader, well, how hard could it be? This isn't that big
Right.
of a lift and shift, and that's
Right.
another thing you should never say to yourself. How hard could it be? I mean, you're begging for troubled waters.
Oh, John, some of my rookie mistakes as a leader in the younger years are just uh, implementing a change that to me just seemed like so inconsequential, whether it be um, how people sign up for vacation days every year, whatever it
Yeah,
is, and it just blows up in your face, and it's just like my typical initial reaction is either grow up or get over it or whatever, and it's like, no, this is their world. This is pay attention to this reaction that you're getting and the emotions that are there. It's important to them. Don't minimize that. Pay attention to it because it you need them.
yeah,
Uh, you need their wholehearted endorsement and buy-in.
yes, yep. And so maybe alongside all this, another watch out for, a myth to avoid. We've talked so much around how a lot of our behaviors as leaders come from a place of good intent. On the other side of that is it's easy to assume, as you face resistance from the team and pushback and tough feedback that's sends a change initiative sideways. It's easy to assume, well, my employees are getting up in the morning wanting to be naysayers. They don't want to fall in line. They're looking to disrupt this organization. They're fit to be tied. Those are negative, dangerous assumptions to be making about your team. Now, are there people who get up in the morning and want to be a naysayer and will, yeah, but there's far fewer of those folks walking around than we allow ourselves to believe. And so to your point, Doug, you have to assume that when you're faced with some, real tough resistance and pushback on an idea that you're sitting there going, this wouldn't be that hard, that's their reality. They're
Yeah.
speaking their truth. And so the worst thing you can do is assume, well, they're just trying to disrupt things and cause havoc. No, they're speaking their truth, and we have to be mindful of that because it'll get in the way of the effectiveness of the change.
Well, and it's John, as you were talking about that, it's so holistically, when I think about change inside organizations, I like to consider what is the track record and credibility of the leaders inside this organization for change. Played out at the extreme, and I definitely experienced this in my consulting work. Organizations that are out there, some of them can be so oh, in search for that magic, program of the month.
Yeah.
And after a while, when these programs get implemented or changes get implemented, they're going to really help the organization and their performance, however that's defined. And that doesn't work and that doesn't work. And it does create some skeptics inside the organization. It's like, yeah, well, this too shall pass. And so
Right.
those naysayers that you're talking about, sometimes they have really good reasons to be naysayers. And one of the things, if kind of not the, I was going to call it the tail end of change, but is as you implement change, some's going to work better than others. It's a learning experience. But for those changes that haven't worked, that haven't delivered what they had anticipated to deliver, I think sometimes leadership teams fail to address that.
Yeah.
And to them, it's like, well, let's move on to the next idea. It's gonna and I think associates so appreciate, and it establishes credibility for a leadership group that's willing to say, you know what, X that we implemented hasn't worked, and here's why, and here's what we learned. Thank you for your efforts in helping us implement this, but that wasn't. It turns out that wasn't the best decision for us. So I was listening to um, a radio show just a couple weeks ago. Now, here's the caveat: the show that I was listening to, I find very credible, and I've not gone online to research it, so I'm not going to name the specific retailer. But this retailer, they're pharmaceutical, neighborhood
Hmm.
kind of retailer, like the Walgreens, CVS, those types.
Sure.
So this one had a public company had lost a ton of money the same quarter a year ago. And one of the assumptions they made, the reason they're losing so much money is theft in stores, shoplifting. And so senior leadership, went to the analyst. They announced this big rollout that they were going to do. You talk about impacting your frontline people. And they're like, we're just going to make it harder for people to shoplift and steal from us. So we're going to put more items in our store under lock and key.
Mm.
So any of us that have been in an environment where I want to come in and purchase something, and then I have to find an associate to go unlock that case. One, the message it communicates to me as a customer, I don't appreciate. Two, it's time consuming. So if I can buy that same item next door, maybe pay a little bit more, but get the hell out of there, I'm going to do it. And then the hassle for the associates. So anyway, next quarter rolls around. They just released the results, and their losses for this same quarter compared to last year had increased 200%.
Oh my gosh.
You can't sit there and say, well, it's all because of this change that was implemented. But that's when I hear stories like this, my instinct, my gut feel is you came up with an idea that's a lose for your customers. It's probably a lose for your associates. It probably drove them crazy. How much money, capital investment did you have to make in fixtures and locks, and what kind of training did you put in place? So John, it's when you hear things like that no wonder there are people inside organizations that work there that just lose faith in the credibility of their leadership team, saying, are you that just so out of touch with what's going on? You assumed you fully understood what the root cause was of what our financial issue is. This was your big idea to change it. Now, what would be interesting to me is then what's going to be the follow-up from the leadership team, not just to the stock analysts, because their stock just took a huge hit based on these earnings, but to their associates. Do they owe their associates an apology? Say, we just made a really bonehead decision, and here's what we learned from. So anyway, it's the naysayers, if you have those prevalent in your organization, is to take a step back and say, why are they that way? What is the history in our organization around change and how we implement it? And what's our success rate? And when we don't succeed, how do we handle that? So just, I think, things to think about, because it can snowball. And before you know it, the naysaying, the negativity, the resistance to change can just become part of your culture.
Yep.
And as you mentioned before, leadership and how we lead and how we interact has more to do with our experience in the workplace than anything else. So, some people are naysayer by just their natural personality, the devil advocate person I mentioned earlier. But a lot of people, it's just the experience they've had inside the organization.
Yeah. Well, and their experience of how change is couched. And so I struggle with the term selling change, because I think selling change, again, from a place of good intent on the leader's part, will lead us to communicate in a way that's not 100% authentic. And so, one of the ideas we need to wrap our head around is any change initiative. For one, at the executive table, we need to stop searching for silver bullets as an organization. Oh, this change is going to, fix everything. No, it won't. And so you need to be mindful, how are leaders messaging this change? Because sometimes when you're really, as a leader, from a place of good intent, wanting people to buy in, you'll really sell it. And in selling it, maybe promise things that are, they aren't actually true. And so it's a big watch out for in your change communication is make promises you can keep as a leader when it comes to change communication. And so for me, what that would include is promising people, hey, this isn't going to be easy. I realize that. And I'm interested to learn, what obstacles you can see. Help me see around some corners on this one. But I also want to tell you this change is not the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
This is intended to bring some modest improvement. And here's how I believe that will take place. As opposed to, oh, this is the greatest thing. You're going to love it. Everyone else loved it. The testing locations loved it.
Right.
It's not the greatest thing ever. It's about modest improvements we make as an organization by way of change that over time, yes, exponentially change the organization's direction. But this one singular item or event, it's about modest improvements. And so be mindful of how you're selling it, because that
Yeah.
will influence your communication related to it. And, I think a big watch out for is, again, making promises you can keep as a leader. Big one for me. So I think where this all leads us, the irony is you and I talk about, change leadership, and the human side of it is there is a process you got to follow to lead people through change. And so follow us here, because we're still very much on this human side, the human impact that change brings. But there is a process that we want to talk you through that I think can help us all understand, well, what type of communication should I be thinking about as a leader? How do I make promises I can keep? How do I, seek out resistance, get it out on the table and overcome it? This process is intended to help you understand what are human beings going through as the change hits. And again, continuing to credit the source, I mentioned them in our last episode, but much of our theory that we want to bring to you around change leadership is from Pritchett. They're an organization, again, out of Dallas, Texas, does a wonderful job. In my 15 years of kind of learning more about change, trying to be a better leader with change, and fast forward to today, trying to help organizations be better at leading and navigating change, I haven't found a better resource than Pritchett when it comes to how they depict the human experience and how they propose leaders handle it. So real quick, as you think about maybe more, again, the process or project side of change, it can be very easy to think about change as, well, there's a beginning of the project, a middle of the project, and then the end of the project. And the end of the project, let's say this thing launches on June 1st, that's the end. Well, one of the first things that you need to think about in terms of the human experience is that's backwards from how human beings actually encounter change. And so the first thing that people think about when they hear about a new change is not, oh, exciting, this is a beginning, can't wait to start. What their mind typically gravitates towards is this is actually an ending. And well, what does that mean, an ending? Well, the way it was is over. We're not going back to that. And what this change will bring, first and foremost, is maybe a sense of loss, maybe an encountering of things that I personally enjoyed doing, had comfort doing. And so there's some emotions tied to that. But most importantly, the first thing that happens when we hear about a new change is something is ending, something is going away. And so, Doug, your experience with some of the emotions related to that, and I think we both need to share with our listeners what are some leadership tactics that can be used in this particular phase, because it's the first thing we face.
Yeah. Well, and John, the first time that I became familiar with the Pritchett change model that you use so effectively with your clients, and it was not part of the work that I did. I wish I'd been aware of it, especially back in my leadership career. And the first time I heard about this model is that the start is really what's ending really resonated with me. And I didn't have to look beyond just myself. Meaning, if I just reflect on changes I've experienced, both in my professional life and even my personal life, the endings part is something to really pay attention to. And people are going to experience endings in different ways. So, for example, inside an organization, if this change means that we're going to do something different, or it's done with different, I mean, whatever the change involves, for some people that can be pretty welcome news. For other folks who maybe were just instrumental in creating what is today, And that's probably, John, where I experienced the most in my career and did not appreciate. Especially, I worked in several different organizations, before I started my own business. And as a new leader coming in, wanting to come in, and we talked about in our last episode, make that change, make a splash, make things happen. And what I did not appreciate, even though maybe the changes I was proposing, things I wanted to do, had a ton of merit, it was the right thing to do. I underestimated how um, hard those changes could be for folks that had worked in that organization for quite some time and put their blood, sweat, and tears into doing it a certain way. And John, the reality is, whatever it was that we're changing today, back when whenever it started, it probably made sense. And it was a great idea. And in fact, that idea probably changed something that was done before it. I mean, it's just this ever evolving. And so I think the emotional impact of ending is it's very natural for people to question their value, their worth, the contributions that ideas made to the organization. It you see it all the time in restructuring, and people placed in new roles or roles disappear. I mean, all that is so hard. And John, I for certain really underestimated how much you need to pay attention to that and allow people to, the term gets used a lot, but process it.
Yeah.
And as leaders, to be with people as they're processing it and look for opportunities to lift up people and respect what they've done before. And for many people, they're just going to get through that on their own timeline.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this isn't hey, let's go for a cup of coffee in the morning, and 30 minutes later, hey, we good? No, probably not. So it's this notion that the beginning of this is really what's ending for people, I think is just critical for leaders to pay attention to.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of so many scenarios in those turnaround situations that I led where, it wasn't just about coming in and making a splash. It's no, this particular location needs change.
Yep.
And how easy it is, through your own hubris or ego to come in and assume, well, they get it. They know this thing needs to change. And you come in and just inadvertently kind of bastardize their past. And just,
Yep.
I'm here to save you heathens from the dark ages. And we're going to go in this new exciting direction. Aren't you excited? And it's like, well, to your point, Doug, thanks a lot.
Yep.
Thanks for stepping all over what we thought was good work, the blood, sweat, and tears we've put in. So many dangerous assumptions are made when you do that as a leader, and terrible messages are sent to the team when you don't honor the past and you aren't extremely thoughtful that this is an ending for people before it's excitement around anything new.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's not easy to do because it's unique to a person. And it takes a lot of conversation and communication, and likely, to your point, takes time that maybe sometimes we feel we don't have. It's like, well, we're moving forward. I've already been told. The executive team said this is going live. All the more reason, earlier when we're talking about communication on a timeline, getting people involved earlier, finding out what is ending.
Mm-hmm.
What is going to be the impact of this on people? Let's not guess around that. Let's ask. We can anticipate some of it, and I think that shows a lot of thoughtfulness and vulnerability if you can do that effectively. But you got to ask. Got to ask people, what's the impact of this going to be? Where does it kind of shake you up?
Yep.
What excites you? What concerns you? Those types of questions to really unearth what is each individual on my team going to need to overcome.
Yes. Yep.
And that's again where people start to experience that first sense of loss. It's not excitement around what's new; it's what's going away.
Well, and John, it's in our conversations around change, it's been really focused on like an initiative or a project or something that's happening. But Even change in leadership can have that impact as well. And so the concepts that we're talking about, when a change in leadership has been made, and sometimes it was an expected change, somebody just retired or whatever. Sometimes a decision's made that, excuse me, that the organization needed a different type of leader. And so just being aware of that as well. It's not just projects, but when relationships have changed, it's the same cycle that people go through. Is what's ending for you now that this person that used to be here or was leading this organization is no longer here? To understand, especially as a new leader coming in, is just to get a sense of where are people in terms of accepting the change, which is me as the new leader. So it applies in those situations as well.
Yeah. Well, and it leads to another important point, which is we're going to describe this process, this human process we go through as change sets in, very nice and neat and orderly, one at a time. We all know the reality of our teams is they're going through multiple things at the same time. And so being mindful of the fact, well, yeah, with this particular change, they're in endings, but maybe with this other big change, they're in a different phase of their emotional journey. And so being mindful of it's not just one thing at a time. It's really this sometimes roller coaster of emotions, highs and lows on, different topics at the same time. And again, to a person, how one change is impacting, that's a high for that person and a low for this other person.
Yes.
And so it's, again, I'll say it's messy, really messy, and requires a lot of vulnerability and communication for you as the leader.
Yes, it does. Yeah. The one thing about the initial stage of change when it's introduced and dealing with endings. And John, unfortunately for me in my career, I didn't experience this much at all, but sometimes change has to happen and quickly. And so I don't want anybody listening to this to think, well, our organization is on fire, it's sinking, and we got to do something quickly or we're not going to be a viable organization. It's like, well, yeah, but you got to, let's take the next 12 months to allow people to, it doesn't work that way either. And so a bit of the art, I think, of change leadership in this case is combining it with where people are and what does the organization need in terms of that pacing. And sometimes if it is a burning platform, I'm not saying you totally ignore the emotional element of it and the people side, but sometimes it's a matter of coming in, we got to go. And I'm going to do as much as I can to explain why we're doing it, get your reaction to it. But again, I think those are more extenuating circumstances. I don't think that's typical. But there are situations where you just got to go. We got to make this happen and do as much as you can to bring people along with you.
Well, and sadly, to be honest, I think that's becoming somewhat a norm for some organizations as they try to figure out what spaghetti is going to stick to the wall. We're going to try multiple different things. And so I love your last point there is just honoring that and stating that as the leader, saying this isn't going to be pretty. and here's why this all needs to happen kind of simultaneously. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm intending to ignore how this is impacting you. We're going to be honest with each other through this process, but I'm here to tell you, and this is maybe another tip or trick as a leader through change. I'm going to let you know this is impacting me too. I'm not terribly excited around how this is all hitting, kind of simultaneously. However, I'm confident we can work through this, together. And so that level of kind of honest, messy communication, you may feel like, well, boy, John, that's going to scare people off. In my experience, what scares people off is when they can't trust you because you sit on information and when they feel like you are breaking promises. Hey, don't worry. It's all going to be fine. This will all slow down, when we get to March. March comes and it's still an S show. It's like, make promises you can keep here. And, don't lead people on. Let them know early. This is not going to be fun. We're going to bump our head in a few places. And I'm counting on you to help us get through this because it won't work without you. And so that's somewhat of the communication style that can really resonate in this first phase.
Well, and just maybe last thing I'll contribute to this first phase of endings is when it makes sense and can be helpful, be willing to be vulnerable and share what your endings process was like around this idea. So we talked before about, as a leader, you may have been privy to this change for several months, and you've already kind of worked through the roller coaster of it. And as you're talking to team members, is to even be as bold as to say something like, you know what, when I first heard about this considered change, here was my reaction, and it was X. Maybe it wasn't. I wasn't excited about. I didn't understand it. It was intimidating to me. Now I've had the luxury of spending some time with this for the past several months, and I've come a long ways in my thinking around this. But I want to tell you, when I was sitting right where you are right now, hearing it for the first time, here's my reaction to it. And I think that can go a long ways to helping people understand, okay, my boss isn't just this company person that accepts things and doesn't have an emotional response. And now I think part of that too, that I have been challenged with in my career, is when we're starting to introduce the change, and I'm still going through my endings process and I still have doubts and reservations. I learned to be very intentional and purposeful about what I shared with my team. Mm-hmm. But then I also had other relationships, peers in the organization, where we could just be really honest around. I'm, saying, John, we've been working on this idea for 3 months now. I am still really concerned about X. Now, that's probably not real good for me to tell my team that.
Right.
But so anyway, it's just know that as leaders, we're going through the same thing. And what's helpful to share with your team that can help them kind of process what they're going through as well.
Yeah. So if I were asked, what's the number one piece of advice you'd give leaders, about change? Because there's a lot of different tips, and tactics that can be used to effectively navigate change. Probably, if put on the spot, my number one piece of advice would be lead yourself through it as well. First, if you can. Sometimes that's not possible, but oftentimes we can turn ourselves into that kind of corporate stooge, that robot, not be mindful of our own emotions and processing of the change, and then turn right around and try to sell it to others. Well, people see right through that. And we've got to be honest with ourselves. Where are we at with this? What communication do we need if we're in endings? Who do we need to go talk to? And be very mindful of that, your own experience of change, because that impacts your ability to lead others through it. And then, I love what you said around making sure there's a balance to what you're sharing with your team. I think you can effectively balance with your team. Hey, here's some concerns I have, and here's where some of my optimism emanates from. Here's what I'm excited about. Here's what gives me hope that this will turn out. Here's what I've learned that I think really makes sense about this change. And so providing that balanced message to the team, I think, one, helps you sleep well at night, but two, I think continues to build that trust with the team. It's like, okay, Doug isn't a phony. He has emotions. He's not a robot. He's going through this as well. It just goes a really long way. So that's our first phase, this endings piece, and being mindful of what's going away. Probably as a last point, one of the things that you'll start to see crop up right in this first phase, and we'll talk a lot about it through all three phases, is resistance. And so maybe as an aside, real quick, one of the things I would recommend to everyone when it comes to resistance is, one, to accept it as natural and necessary. It's a big part of change. And, that can ruffle some feathers. People are uncomfortable when members of the team are pushing back, and maybe there's some, fiery conversations taking place and some real pushback that you're experiencing. What I might challenge you to think about is, what if the opposite were true? And here's what I mean by that. You're having a meeting after the meeting. The new change initiative has been launched, and you go to help your team digest what's going on. And in your mind, this is going to impact them. There's going to be some loss. There's going to be some serious concerns and questions. So you set up this meeting after the meeting and you throw it out to the team. And maybe you ask something like, how are we all doing with this? I want you to ask yourself, what if you got no response? It was just crickets in the room. Arms folded, people kind of shrugging. No, we're good. I might actually be concerned. Are these people listening? Are they engaged? And so resistance not only needs to be anticipated, but I want you to challenge yourself to accept it as something that is a good kind of litmus test of people's engagement and passion. Because at the very root of resistance, the core reason, why in the heck would someone push back on something if they didn't care?
Yep.
So I don't know about you as a leader, but if I know you care, I can deal with that. We can work through some things if I know this is coming from a place of passion and engagement. And so the only reason in the world that people push back on change initiatives is they care. They care about the contributions they've made up until this point. They care about their comfort level and their ability to perform in the old world. And we're now changing that. And so this endings phase brings this first news of resistance, and that can cause sometimes a visceral reaction for a leader. It can scare leaders off. As much as you can, I say step into it, get it out on the table. You might even think about offering some gratitude when you encounter it. It's like, yes. Thanks, Doug. I can see how much you care. We could deal with that. Versus the alternative, which is, do you not care? Are you not sharing with me? Or we're not being honest here? There's something else probably wrong if you're not encountering resistance.
Yeah, it's an organization where I serve on the board. We recently did first time ever an associate engagement survey. And when you've never done those before, the initial first round of results you get can be kind of interesting. For some people, it's can be a dump your bucket kind of thing. In this case, what happened is we had a very low response rate on people participating. And so I'm talking to the leader, and this leader is trying to just figure out, what does this low response rate mean? It could mean all kinds of things. I suppose at one end, it's like, God, it's so good here. I don't have anything to offer. It's don't change a thing. Everything's great. Another thing we talked about is they're fearful of giving their feedback and what it might mean. But the other thing that popped up as you're talking about care as the core of resistance is people have just checked out.
Yeah.
They've just thought, why even waste my time doing this? Probably nothing's going to happen anyway. And I think of all the different scenarios that you could have, people that are, the old cliche, they quit their job, but they're still there and get a paycheck, is just a terrible place to be. And in this particular case, I think that's probably what's going on inside this organization. We just were, the leadership team was really looking forward to getting great input and even the tough messages, but they just weren't even getting people to come in and participate. And so we're trying to understand that better. What is really behind this low level of response? So when you initiate change like this and you're not getting resistance, or people like, yeah, we're good, don't just ignore that. Get underneath that and try to figure out what's going on, because to your point, that probably indicates not a real healthy situation.
Yeah.
And so anyway, great. I love that notion that care is at that root of resistance. And when you lose the care, then you're just not, whatever. We'll go with it.
Yeah. One other reaction I just want to touch on that can happen sometimes as you first introduce change and you're really in this endings phase in terms of the person you're speaking with. What if their reaction is so visceral, it's like, I don't want to go in that direction. One of the things to keep in mind throughout this human process of change as a leader is a lot of empathy. And it's one of those unique opportunities to really combine accountability and empathy simultaneously. The accountability is, we're making this change. It rolls out June 1st. Yep. Eventually, we're going to get there. The empathy side is, and I appreciate we've got some stuff to work through to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've had situations where the empathy required is, yeah, maybe this isn't the right fit for you. And in some of those turnaround situations that I led, realizing there's some members of the team here that this is too many trips around the merry-go-round. And whether it's my fault or not, they're not game for this new direction. Well, if you're not having the types of conversations that make it okay to talk about that, that's where you can end up with some quit and stays.
Yep.
And so I think this front end, this endings phase is one of the first opportunities to identify, is this person hopeful that they can get there? Because I'll help them get there. Or is this too much? Which is okay too. That's got to be fine. And that's the empathy part of it is, I can't see myself going in that direction. This is too much change. It takes my role away from the very reasons why I felt like I wanted to join this organization. A lot of reasons why that could be the case, but be empathetic around, does this person actually want to be on board with these new changes? Don't assume it.
Yep.
And that all happens in this first phase. So I want to dig into the second two phases, but I also want to be in honor of people's time. Great conversation on this first phase and kind of setting the tone for some tips and tricks around just getting comfortable with messy, infrequent, informal communication, engaging this with a lot of vulnerability, managing our own experience, sometimes simultaneously to the experience of our teams through this change process, and appreciating with this first phase, the first thing that people experience is not, jubilation and excitement around the new idea. It's actually, well, what about the past? What's going away? And that's what has to be, really led through first in this change process. So Doug, I look forward to coming back and talking about the next two phases and the communication tips and tricks that overlay with that. But a great start and hopefully enjoyable to all of you out there. Thanks so much for tuning in. Tune in next time as we continue our conversation around change leadership and communication. Take care.